you mentioned, Abdurrahman Khan there, and for, me being a Hazara, and he's, for us, the source of our tragedy, in a sense, begins with him. I mean, what
Mhm.
was that source of destruction in the 1890s between the Abdurrahman and the Hazaras?
Oh, I mean, well, I think it's, I don't know how to describe it really. I mean, and I think the Australian government has actually recognised it as genocide, as officially,
Mm,
um, and they've given Hazaras a special sort of niche in terms of immigration because of that. Um, I mean, it was certainly genocidal. You could argue, as some of my colleagues have done, as a well, it was justifiable in a sense because they needed to control the area and it was a revolt. But I mean, Abdulrahman Khan. I mean, as I point out, I mean if you go back into the 1880s, 1888, with the rebellion of the Sadr Khan up in Turkestan, we actually have the atrocities that were taking place. I mean, the British reports themselves, in which eyewitnesses report, people like Griesbach,
mm,
and the Vakil, the Munshi, the British Munshi, writing these reports, which are just like um, the guys are in sort of total trauma themselves with what they've seen, um, about what's going on and the executions and the barbarity that was taking place, and just like everybody who's, I mean, hundreds, we don't know how many people were killed, and we find the British themselves talking about in the reports which I published in my previous book on the ancient
mm.
supremacy. The reports there, the British are saying, they're using the word um, oh, I've forgotten the words. So they talk about it as uh, not so they don't use the word genocide because the word genocide is the word that is created later. They're talking about it in terms of serious atrocities, um, of and they're appalled, but they do nothing about it. Basically, they write a letter that Viceroy writes to the Emir and says, that's not really, really a good thing that you're doing, and you should stop it. But yeah, at the same time, you need to repress your enemies, deal justice. But they just say, well, at the end of the day, they couldn't do anything about it. Because what do you do? The only thing the British could have done was invaded again, and
Mm.
had yet another war in Afghanistan, which they could come out with a bloody nose. Um, so you talk about it as a reign of terror, and so we have this in a sense almost like a precursor to what happens in Hazarajat. I mean, unfortunately, the reign of Abdulrahman Khan, was one, of huge atrocities against many people, and I think the Hazara wars were probably the worst because by this time, by the mid 1890s, Abdurrahman Khan was, if not quite insane, but he was certainly totally, he was at the point where he was in any other situation he would have been either displaced or he would have, wouldn't have been eligible to reign to rule because of his basically the way in which his illness had eating into his brain and into his whole psyche. But I mean, I think what happened to the Hazara communities. I mean, was appalling, and terrible, and and I know it resonates very strongly within the Hazara community to this day. In a sense, it's kind of like almost an identifying or thing. It's kind of like we share this
Mm.
pain, this agony, regardless of which particular faction or whatever we come from. It wasn't. I don't know. Technically you could classify it as genocide. I mean, I can't find any account of anything going on in like across into the western side of Yakolang and that area. I don't even know whether it was mostly Bamiyan and Hajikak and sort of like
Ura's gone.
Uruzgan, but like Yakolang doesn't seem to come into that. I don't
Mm.
know why, but I mean it's probably too remote. But yeah, I think it was an awful, thing, and it would be nice if somewhere along the line there was some sort of recognition of that by the state. But I think it's how I think it comes back to how one defines oneself. Do you define oneself on that basis, or because of something different? For me, the comparison, I mean, as you know, I'm writing a book on the Afghan community, the Armenian community of Afghanistan. You know, if you look at the Armenian case, I mean, they suffered two genocides, one in the late 1800s and one during the First World War, at the hands of not really so much the Ottoman state, although the Ottoman state encouraged it, but at the hands of local Kurds, but also local militias, but also the Turkish army was involved. And I mean, it's recognized officially as a genocide by some countries anyway. And I mean, the accounts of that was just as harrowing probably as some of the ones that we read from the account of the Hezara Wars and the atrocities that were committed there. But the Armenians still own that. I mean, I went some years ago to a commemoration of the Armenian genocide. It was held in Auckland. There was a number of Armenians there. So for them, it's part of their history. It's very much part of their identity, but they also have moved on in terms of, we recognize this, we accept this, we would like that to be recognized internationally. I'm not sure whether the New Zealand government has done so or not, but we know that's part of our history, and it's a horrible part of our history, but we have moved on as well from that. We haven't just been defined just purely by that pain and by that suffering and by that, you know, the terrible things that happened when our ancestors were massacred and, you know, left to starve. And, you know, I mean, it's horrible. And there's photographs about it, which we don't have from the Hezara Wars, but, you know, we have photographic records of you know, bodies being strewn by the road and burnt in churches and things. It was, and a lot of reports as well in the Anglican Church, in records in London, and American reporters. So we have a lot of documentation on it. Unfortunately, with the Hezara War, there's very, very little in that respect, because it was too early. But yeah, I mean, I you know, I can understand how Hazaras feel, in a sense. I mean, I've never had to go through that sort of thing. I've never had my family sort of, you know,
and I suppose it's part of the, you know, because of the continued persecution, I suppose you cannot, you know, the Armenians, for example, have had their own state, and they've had you know, they've got a history where, you know, they've got a semblance of, not a semblance, but they've had prosperity per, you know, modern standards, a state, a history, a place in the world, but the Hazaras have not really had that.
I mean, I think very much, I mean, again, my question is to what extent was the Hazara governed by Kabul? I actually think, reading the sources there, basically it was mostly self-governing by local tribal leaders or clan leaders. There are all sorts of different terms being used in different parts of the Hazara Jal for people who are power brokers, whether those are indigenous names or whether they were ones that have been borrowed or imposed. But